Think about someone you knew before they changed. Not someone who grew up or matured or made different choices. Someone who came back from somewhere and was genuinely different. Different eyes, different way of moving through a room, different things they laughed at or stopped laughing at. Maybe it was someone who went to war. Maybe someone who lost someone. Maybe someone who spent a long time somewhere very far from everything they knew. And you remember thinking, I don't know who this person is anymore. That feeling, specific and quiet, and impossible to explain to someone who hasn't had it, is what the families of pirates wrote about, over and over, in the letters that survived, in the testimony given at trials, in the accounts of port chaplains who interviewed captured men before their executions. The ocean changed them, not metaphorically. It changed who they actually were. Here's what most people assume about pirates: that the ones who came from ordinary lives, from fishing villages, from merchant families, from dock worker households, that they were always different, always restless, always the kind of person who was going to end up somewhere strange. The records don't support that. Trial transcripts from the Golden Age of piracy, the period roughly spanning 1680 to 1730, contain testimony from men whose backgrounds were completely unremarkable. Men who had fathers, brothers, wives waiting on shore. Men who had been, by every account, ordinary before the sea. What's strange isn't that some of them changed. What's strange is how consistent the change was. How many families described the same things in the same language about men who had come from completely different places and circumstances? The words that appear most often: quieter, harder, somewhere else. That's not what happened to one of them. It's what happened to most of them. But the ocean didn't just take things away, it replaced them. Modern neuroscience has a term for what prolonged exposure to extreme environments does to the human mind. It's called allostatic load, the accumulated cost of chronic stress on the brain's regulatory systems. On a pirate ship in the early 18th century, that load was total. Irregular sleep, disrupted by watches and storms, and the constant low-level vigilance of living among armed men in a confined space. Nutritional deficiency, scurvy beginning within weeks of leaving port, affecting cognition and mood before it affected the body visibly. Social isolation from the world ashore, which the brain processes differently from the isolation of solitude. It's not being alone that causes the change, it's being cut off from the specific people who anchor your sense of self. Neurologists who study the effects of long-term maritime isolation using modern submarine crews and Antarctic research stations as proxies have documented measurable changes in emotional regulation, risk assessment, and identity coherence after periods as short as 3 months. Not damage, change. The brain adapts to the environment it's in. It becomes more suited to that environment and less suited to the one it left. A pirate who spent 2 years on the water wasn't the same person who had stepped aboard. His brain had literally reorganized around different conditions. And here's where it gets harder to explain. The historian Marcus Rediker, in his study of the Golden Age, found something in the archival record that he didn't expect. Among the documents from pirate trials, the testimony, the chaplain's interviews, the occasional letter that made it through, there's a recurring pattern in how men describe themselves in relation to their former lives. Not regret, exactly. Not longing, though that appeared too. Something closer to puzzlement. Men who seemed genuinely unsure whether the person who had left home was the same one sitting in the dock, who described their former selves in the third person, who couldn't explain to the chaplains who pressed them what the turning point had been. The families, in the accounts that survived, described something similar from the outside. Brothers who came back from sea and sat in rooms they had grown up in and seemed to be visiting. Wives who wrote that they could see their husbands behind their husbands' eyes, but couldn't reach them. Mothers who said their sons had come back, but their sons hadn't come back. This wasn't grief or trauma in the way we now use the word. It was something more neutral and more permanent. The sea had simply become their actual home. and everywhere else had become foreign. There's one letter that stays with you after reading it. Mary Red was one of the few documented female pirates of the Golden Age, sailing under the flag of Calico Jack Rackham in the Caribbean in the early 1720s. She was captured in 1720, tried in Jamaica, and died in prison shortly after, likely from fever contracted during her imprisonment. Among the documents from her trial is a fragment of testimony that historians have returned to repeatedly. She was asked by the presiding judge whether she understood that she had placed herself outside the protections of civilized society. Her answer, paraphrased in the court record, was essentially yes, and that this had been a condition of the life, not a consequence she had failed to anticipate. She was then asked whether she missed the life she had left. The court record notes a pause before she answered. She said she didn't know how to compare them anymore, that the person who had started that life was not the same person answering the question. She said this not as a defense, and not with apparent distress. She said it as a simple observation about what had happened to her. The judge apparently had no follow-up question, but here's the part nobody talks about. Psychologists who study identity change in extreme environments have identified something that matters here. They call it narrative identity disruption, the breakdown of the continuous story a person tells themselves about who they are and where they're going. Under ordinary circumstances, this story is remarkably resilient. People can absorb enormous change and still maintain a sense of continuity. The self that existed at 15 connects through memory and narrative to the self at 40. What breaks that continuity isn't pain or loss or even trauma. What breaks it is the sustained total replacement of the environment in which the self was built. When the physical surroundings, the social relationships, the daily rhythms, the threats, the pleasures, and the meanings of small actions all change at once and stay changed for long enough, the brain stops trying to maintain the connection to the previous environment. It rebuilds around the new one. The men who returned from years of piracy and seemed to their families like strangers weren't damaged. They weren't broken. They had simply been rebuilt. And the rebuilding was so complete that there was no clear path back. Port chaplains who worked with captured pirates in the last days before execution noted something consistent in their accounts. Men who could describe their former lives in detail, names, places, specific memories, but who described them with the same flat affect they might use for someone else's history. Not forgetting. Something more like detachment from a story that no longer felt like theirs. One chaplain wrote, "He spoke of his mother with evident tenderness, and yet with the manner of a man recalling a book he had read, rather than a life he had lived. Here's what stayed with me after all of this. The families who watched someone come back changed, who looked at a person they had known completely and understood that something essential was different. They had no vocabulary for what they were seeing. They didn't have the neuroscience. They didn't have the concept of allostatic load or narrative identity or environmental rebuilding. What they had was the specific weight of recognizing that the person they had been waiting for wasn't coming back, that the person who had returned was real and present, and in some cases, still kind, but was occupying a body they knew, speaking with a voice they knew, from a place they couldn't follow. What the ocean did to pirates wasn't unusual in kind. Extreme environments have always done this to people. What was unusual was the completeness of it. The sea offered no halfway state. You were on the water or you weren't. You were part of the ship or you were nothing. There was no weekend visit home to re-anchor yourself to who you had been. The change was total because the removal was total, and the families who felt the loss most acutely were the ones who had been closest, not because the pirates loved them less, but because the distance between who they had been and who they had become was most visible to the people who had known both versions. They hadn't lost someone to death. They had lost someone to distance. That's harder, in some ways. So think again about the person you knew before they changed. Whatever took them, war, grief, time, distance, something you couldn't follow them into. They didn't choose to leave the version of themselves you knew. Nobody does. The self doesn't make that decision. The environment makes it slowly, through repetition and replacement, and the brain's relentless insistence on adapting to wherever it actually is. The pirates who came back to port and sat in their childhood homes like visitors weren't indifferent to what they had lost. The letters suggest otherwise. The pauses in the trial testimony suggest otherwise. They were just living proof of something the ocean had always known, and humans take longer to understand. That who we are is not fixed. That the self is not a thing you carry with you, sealed and protected, through whatever happens. It's something that forms in response to where you are. Change the where enough, for long enough, and you change the who. The families were right. The person they knew hadn't come back, but the person who had was real too. They just didn't have a name for him yet.